Hi friends, welcome to the first video in DevOps series. So the very first thing that everyone should learn when they are starting DevOps, right? They should know about the very first segment of the tool, that is version control system, right? So version control system is a separate entity in the DevOps tools. It's kind of a diversification. So we are all working with developers or the people. If you are starting your career as a developer, the first point that the first responsibility that a developer should write is should have is he should write the development code, right? So the code writing, so the code writing is very big responsibility, and without code, the applications will not run. And that's how it is. The baseline SLA has been built that developers are going to write the code and hand over it to the testing or operations team. So here, while writing the code, what are the precautions that we need to take? Right, so for example, if you are the only single person, let's say I have some X person only working on writing some block of code, so he knows that what he is writing at any point of time he can make changes, and he can track those changes, what changes he have done. But when people, like in a project, you will be having 20 to 30 people, those who are especially expertise in writing code, right? So as a DevOps engineer, not only a DevOps engineer, you may be a fresher, or you may be a experienced person, or you may be a fresher internship who are going to enter into the IT industry as a software intern. Then you need to be more keen on understanding this version control system, right? So like all the freshers, those who are especially working on writing the code in Visual Studio Code. So today in this class, I'm going to teach you how can you manage with the version control in your code by using a separate tools in DevOps. Right, so this is very important. So every day as a DevOps engineer, or as a software developer, or as a fresher intern, so everyone in IT industry have to work on this particular tool. So guys, please keep concentrate when I was talking about all the topics in this particular tool, because it is very much important. You have to, if you have any doubts, and you can post under the comment section so that I can reply you. Right, so let's get started. So in a team who are having 30 members or 40 members, if they are writing code, so you need a dedicated tool which basically tracks the changes made by which particular person, right? So the version control system, we call it as version. Version is nothing but a change, right? Version is a change which can which a new feature or a new update, right? So version is a change. So what you mean by control? You need to have a complete control over what are the versions of your applications, or what are the versions of your code, right? So complete control, that means command over the code track, right? So the system version control, these two words stands for change management, or a command on the changes that you have done, and you have to completely take care of those changes, right? Let me put it in this way: management. So it's change management. So the version control is completely the change management. So in DevOps, so not only in DevOps, in IT industry, what are the different tools that we have in maintaining the source code? So the very famous tool that everyone is aware of is Git. Okay, so Git is the common tool. Even a fresher should have some idea about it, right? So we have one more version control system that is called Bitbucket. So Bitbucket is also a version control tool. And we have Apache Subversion, right? So Subversion, so which is a completely dedicated tool for Apache, which is developed by Apache. So these are all different version control systems that is available in the market, but most of the companies, I mean, I would say 99.99 percentage of the companies will use these two, Git and Bitbucket. So this was eliminated a long way ago. So now we are going to talk about what is version control system and how the process of version control system works. What are the different types of version control system is available in the market, right? So the version control, it can be controlled in two different mechanism. One is a centralized mechanism, the centralized, which everything is collaborated and accumulated in a centralized manner, and along with all together you are going to push your code to the repositories. So before getting into that, you should know what is a repository. So repository, the word itself says where you are going to reposit your files. That means you are going to save your files. You're going to keep your files in a separate directory or in a web-based URL or a place where you are going to store some files or videos or images, whatever it is. So we consider that as a repository, right? So the version is nothing but a change that we have already discussed. So the place where we are having a lot of code files and the tool that basically tracks the changes in that particular code. So that is the reason we call it as a version control system, right? So here, since we have discussed about two different types, the very first one is centralized version control system. Centralized version control system, it is basically we need to evaluate in certain scenarios, right? So for example, let's say you have written a code. Sorry guys, I got a call. So for example, you have written a code and that code was being stored in a repository. So now what you have to do is you may have a lot of changes, you may have a lot of updations in a day which you have to follow and you have to do it. So you are not going to commit and push each and every change that you do, right? In a complete manner, you are going to make all the changes accumulatively and you are going to store at a time, right? So which is centralized version control system. So let me share you a picture which basically represents the exact central control system. So if you see here, right, so the diagram which are right in front of my screen, which illustrates difference between centralized version control system and distributed version control system, right? If you see here, the version control system diagram, which is centralized, is pretty simple and it is having a lot of disadvantages. Let's talk about it first. So here the diagram illustrates these two entities, which is working copy, right? What you mean by working copy? So the working copy is the system or the laptop where you have written your code, right? So the system or the laptop where you have written your code. And completely you are going to write the code and at the end of the day, you are going to update and commit the code to the remote repository. If something goes wrong, right? If something goes wrong, you need to again clone back the repository code from the remote repository. So what do you mean by remote repository, first of all? So when you say working copy, you don't have any internet and you are going to save the files in your laptop file system. And when you say remote repository, something the place where you are going for the web-based URL and there you are going to store your files. So at the end of the day, you are going to push or copy the code files from working copy to the remote. That means from your laptop to the remote web-based URL. So which is again a centralized version control system. So here you don't have internet dependency. I mean, you have a lot of internet dependency. So here you have a lot of advantages as well. If something goes wrong, you cannot revert back as easy as possible in distributed, right? In centralized version control system, only you will be having a copy in your local system where you are going to write some code and at the end of the day, you are going to push it to the remote repository. right? So what happens in distributed version control system? It's quite vice versa. So here you have a buffer area that we call it as a a staging area, right? You see here this section where my cursor is indicating local repository, right? You are going to make all the code changes here, right? You are going to make all the code changes here. And once you completely done with the changes, you are going to save the file system changes into the local repository, right? So what happens if something goes wrong and you want to revert the code back? You can easily revert it from local repository to working copy, where you don't have that kind of option in centralized version control system. Revert, what do you mean by revert, guys? For example, let's say you have written some code lines and you have committed to the local repo, and which you want to get it back. You feel, okay, the code which I have committed is completely wrong, I need to get it back. So then you can get the code back into your working copy, and you can again modify the changes, and you can again commit. That means again you can save to your local system, right? So here you see, you have seen that everything is fine. The code is running perfectly fine in your local system. Then in that case, you are going to push the code into the remote repository, which is again a web-based URL, right? So we are having this kind of staging area in distributed version control system. So that means, so the distributed version control system is better, far better than centralized version control system, since it is having a buffer area which can store all the details and all the history of the code changes in its local repository. As pretty as that. So this is the only difference between distributed and centralized version control system. So let's see into some hands-on. So if I want to illustrate which one is the centralized version control system and which one is the distributed version control system, you need to have a keen idea about the architecture of it, right? You have a local copy in your centralized version control system, and you are going to directly pull that to the remote. Whereas here, first you are going to save in the buffer area, and once all the code changes are going to looking fine and everything is running perfectly in your local, then from that buffer area in another way local repository, we push the code into the remote repository. I'm using a keyword called push, right? Push, push the code into the remote repository. So whereas here, to learn this version control system, you need to have some keywords. So those keywords are local repo and remote repo, staging area, and working directory. So these four keywords you have to be more thorough with, right? So let's get into some hands-on now. So we need to identify which tool is distributed and which tool is version control system based on this scenario. So in the market, right? So the most, the very popular version control system, which is of distributed, is Git, right? So Git. If you see, Git, what it says. It is a distributed version control system that track changes in any set of the files. Okay, usually used for coordinating work among the programmers. Okay, so now how can we set up Git in our local laptop to work or to write or to track the code changes? As I already said in my previous video, when you type Git in Google, you will be having this page that is open. Go to this particular page, and here you can see a download section. When you click on this section, you will be able to see which operating system you have the requirement for. Either you can use Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. If I'm using Windows, So I click on this option, or else directly you can click on the option which is beside the palette, which is here, download for Windows, right? So I'm selecting Windows here, and I'm selecting 64-bit operating system, right? So since because my laptop is 64-bit, I have selected. You can select based on your requirement. So when you click on this particular link, you will be having a setup file which is downloaded over here. And when you click on it, it is a normal extension so that it can install the Git package normally in your laptop, right? So once you install Git, so you have to go to the search bar and time for Git. So when you type Git, you have some tools which are installed: Git Bash, Git GUI, Git CMD. So you can manage Git on any of the tool. But if you are going to do more familiarity with command line, you can use Git Bash or Git CMD, or if you want to manage your Git with graphical user interface, you can use GUI. Okay, so now here I have installed Git Bash, whereas I'm going to open my Git Bash terminal. And what this Git Bash terminal does is, in your local laptop, you can access this mm, details, the file system here, whereas in other laptops or in other um, you know laptops like Unix or Mac OS, you cannot access the file system as easy as possible in Windows. So there you need to use any command line interface where you have to fetch the file or open the file or read the file, cut and copy the file. So for all these operations, you need to have a certain terminal. So in the same way, Git Bash is one of the terminal which helps us to work or track the code changes with the help of the Git, right? So now here, so I have already set up the bash and I have opened it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'll create a directory with a normal Linux command for practicing Git, right? So mkdir, which stands for make directory, and I'm going to give a name for Git practice. Done. So I have given a name called Git practice, and you have to get into Git practice directory. And the very first command you have to, guys, you remember here you have to work with command line interface if you want to start working with your distributed version control system. You can also use GitHub Desktop, which is a enterprise level product where you don't even need to a single command on your system. So now here, whereas I have created a directory and I will create some test files in this directory to show you how Git will track the code and code changes. So here the very first point, if you want your Git tool to track your changes, you have to initialize it. That means you have to start it. The very first point, the very first command that I'm going to use to initialize, to start my Git practice directory as a Git repository, I'm going to use a command called git init, right? Git init. Init stands for initialization. The directory where you are resided in, you are converting that as a Git directory. So I have executing a command git init, which basically initializes and converts a local Linux directory or a Windows directory to a Git directory or a Git repository. Okay, just enter. So what it is saying, initialized empty Git repository in C drive, in users, in Aditya, and Git practice and .git folder has been created. You see here, .git folder has been created. Oops, here I see a name which is in brackets has been created, indicates master. We'll talk about this later in the coming sessions. This is pretty interesting, guys. This is pretty interesting and more important as well. Okay, so we have initialized empty Git repository. So now let me tell you one thing. So all your repository metadata, right? Metadata, that means the data about the data. That means the data about your repository are going to store in this .git folder, right? So let me search or let me hunt for this .git folder. I'm executing a normal Linux command here, ls-lra. You can see .git folder. So if you get into the directory, which is .git, you will be able to go get into the Git directory. That means it says where all the related configurations of your repository will be jumped and copied into this .git directory. So let's do ls here. You can see here the head, the config, the description, the hooks, the info, the objects, the references. So lot many configuration files and directories has been created in this .git folder. Okay, so we know how to delete a directory in Linux. So I'm getting one step back, cd space dot dot. So now I'll come into git practice directory. Yes, I came to git practice directory and I can see the master keyword over here. So now if I'm going to delete rm minus rf dot git, so I'm deleting a directory called dot git and enter. So the master keyword was disappeared. The reason behind it is you have the dot git folder where all the metadata has been stored, and here the master was disappeared in the next command because the metadata of this keyword is being stored in .git folder. And when you delete it, there is no metadata resided in the git practice directory to show or indicate this directory has been initialized with a master. So now if you see, if you try to do git init, again it will initialize the empty git repository. Okay guys, so that's all for this video. We will discuss even more details on version control system in coming videos. Stay tuned for Git series. Thank you so much. If you do like my content, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye bye.